Over the last decade, academics like Hans Rosling have argued we're living in humanity's best era. Extreme poverty plummeting, life expectancy soaring, literacy reaching all-time highs. And yet, despite all this, many of us still feel an unmistakable anxiety about what's ahead. This disconnect fascinates me. How can we simultaneously apparently be living in the best of times while feeling such uncertainty about tomorrow? Whether it's climate catastrophes, teetering economies, or political upheaval, it's enough to make anyone want to pull the covers over their head. So today, I wanted to do something a little bit different from my usual videos and have a deeper look to explore why the future can seem so scary at times. And instead of looking outwards like we usually do at the changing world, for this video, I want to turn inwards. Let's explore the human side of this fear. What's happening in our brains, in our very biology, that triggers this constant state of anxiety? Are we to blame for feeling this way? By the end, you'll know the 3 key reasons why I think so many of us can feel on edge sometimes. And I hope that this may offer some thoughts or reassurance as you think about the path ahead. Let's start with the psychology of change. I want to share a quick story from my own life. Picture this: business school, 10 students settled into our routines, and the professor suddenly orders everyone, switch desks. The reactions were telling. While some complied, others demanded explanations, including myself, or refused entirely. All this resistance to moving from desks that we'd only had for a few weeks. That was my real human lesson in the topic of change management, which, let's be honest, is a boring corporate term for something really deeply human. Our brains crave patterns and predictability. Disrupt that and things can get messy, fast. When we face change, our amygdala, the brain's fear center, can get hijacked, triggering anxiety about everything from genuine threats to whether we left the stove on. The amygdala isn't that great at prioritizing. Through fear conditioning, our amygdala links experiences with danger, whether that's a past dog bite or constant negative news about the future. I experienced this myself with dogs, only overcoming it by watching countless dog videos during COVID. Now, thankfully, our prefrontal cortex usually steps in to regulate that fear. It's the rational part of our brain, the one that assesses threats logically. But constant negativity can overwhelm it, letting the amygdala run wild. Chronic stress primes the amygdala, making us more prone to anxiety. It becomes a vicious cycle. Worrying about the future triggers the amygdala, which makes us worry more, and so on. Another helpful mental model is the Kubler-Ross change curve. You might know it from the stages of grief, but it applies to any big change. It maps out the emotional roller coaster we often ride: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. But remember, there's no set timeline for this. Some changes may lead to adaptation in days, but others might take years. It depends on you, your support system, and the nature of the change itself. And it's not just us individually. Whole societies can feel this collective anxiety when we're faced with rapid shifts in norms, technology, or the environment. I'm old enough to remember the Y2K panic, when everyone thought computers would crash because they couldn't handle the year 2000, because the year field only had 2 characters. The point is, there's nothing wrong with us for feeling this way. It's how we're wired. So that's factor 1. Let's call it the biological reasons why we're prone to getting seasick in the face of change. But for factor 2, let's explore why we're not just seasick, but terrified of falling overboard. What are we so afraid of specifically? To get to the core of this, there are 2 pretty related mental models here that I personally find super helpful. The first is one you'll likely also have come across before, which is Maslow's hierarchy. So quick refresher, Maslow was a famous psychologist, and he proposed a hierarchy of human needs. The basics are the essentials: food, shelter, safety. And once those are met, we can climb towards things like love, belonging, and self-actualization. Now, why that's relevant is it describes why you may be feeling particularly anxious at this moment in time. Because what happens when the very foundation of that pyramid feels shaky? The foundations of society are crumbling in some ways. Some people will point to home ownership slipping away from younger generations, healthcare costs threatening financial ruin, and the gig economy trading stability for flexibility. Each shift erodes what was once considered basic security. And this erosion of basic security triggers a primal fear response. It's like being on a plane and suddenly realizing the oxygen masks haven't dropped despite the cabin losing pressure. Another useful framework for understanding this anxiety is the SCARF model. Developed by David Rock, it highlights 5 social domains that are crucial to our well-being. These are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, hence SCARF. When these are threatened, we react as if we're facing physical danger. And guess what? The rapid changes and uncertainty we're facing today, they threaten those very domains. In today's world, rapid skill obsolescence threatens our status, while economic uncertainty erodes our autonomy and certainty. Meanwhile, social media can amplify perceived unfairness, bombarding us with often artificial displays of inequality and success. So with the SCARF model, they show us how these fundamental social needs are threatened by the rapid, uncertain times we live in, triggering our brain's threat response and fueling our anxiety. We've explored how our brains react to change and why basic securities feel threatened. But there's another crucial factor that amplifies both of these effects. It's speed. Let's imagine for a moment we're back on that boat and we hit a wave going at 5 knots. And you might barely notice. But if you hit that same wave at 50 knots, then suddenly you're gripping the rails. In other words, it's not just the size of the changes, but also the unprecedented velocity at which they're hitting us. We talk about exponential technology progress, and it's not hyperbole. Moore's law, which is the doubling of transistors on a microchip every 2 years, is a prime example. And this acceleration isn't limited to microchips. We see it in data creation, globalization, even the alarming rate of climate change. And our brains have evolved for a linear world. We're struggling to grasp this exponential curve. It's like trying to catch a ball that's constantly accelerating. Eventually, it's impossible to keep up. I recently came across a book called Future Shock, which was actually written back in the 1970s. It describes how rapid societal change can lead to disorientation, anxiety, and even a breakdown in social structures. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The author, Alvin Toffler, argued that when change outpaces our ability to adapt, we experience future shock, a feeling of being overwhelmed, unable to cope with the present, let alone the future. And many argue we're living in that period of unprecedented acceleration right now, making Toffler's predictions more relevant than ever. And maybe this is why that seasickness feels so acute. So let's take a breath. We've covered a lot. To recap, we first looked at the psychology of change, how our brain's wiring makes us naturally anxious about the unknown. Then, with Maslow and SCARF, we explored, well, what are we feeling anxious about? How our basic needs are feeling threatened, like we're about to fall off that boat. And finally, we saw how the sheer acceleration of change amplifies those anxieties. It's not just that we fear change, but how fast it's happening, making it harder to cope. So we have all three of these hitting us at once. And the big question is, what can we do about it? Well, I'm just a random guy on YouTube, so I'm not going to be able to heal or gaslight you into being less anxious, especially if you're going through a tough time right now. I'll always encourage you to form your own point of view, particularly as there's so many paths to navigate for these feelings. But for what it's worth, here's my take on how I'm personally navigating this, and maybe it'll offer something helpful. First, I'm choosing to be optimistic about technology. The advances in AI and quantum computing, particularly in areas like health and material science, could be game changers. With these advances in AI, maybe quantum in the next 10 to 15 years, we might be on the verge of understanding and shaping the universe in ways we never thought possible, hopefully for the benefit of all. I genuinely believe, and I'm hopeful, we could net out with a better future. But I also think the transition will be bumpy, to say the least. We might be in one of those bursts right now. Old systems are breaking down, new ones are emerging. Maybe that's why the anxiety feels more intense now than, say, back in the 90s. This reminds me of a concept called punctuated equilibrium from biology. Long periods of stability are interrupted by bursts of rapid change, leading to new species and ecosystems. So how am I dealing with all of this? I'm trying to internalize a few things. Firstly, I'm trying to remind myself that I should strive to be a high agency individual. This means taking ownership of my life, seeking opportunities, and making conscious choices about how I react to change. It's about focusing on my circle of influence, not feeling helpless. But I also know some forces are beyond my control. So I'm also exploring Stoicism. This is the philosophical outlook that emphasizes focusing on what is within my power, my actions and reactions, and accepting what isn't. Can I be more intentional about applying that to my life, finding inner peace amidst all of this chaos? Being a fan of probabilistic thinking also helps with this. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, instead of seeing the future as one fixed outcome, either utopia or doom, I try to think in ranges of probabilities. Think of it like weather forecasting. A 70% chance of rain means bringing an umbrella. It doesn't mean cancelling the plans. And you can apply this to, say, climate-conscious housing decisions. Instead of coast versus hills, consider probabilities. Extreme areas in some areas? Yep, likely. Uninhabitable cities? Less likely. You can plan accordingly. This helps you make smarter choices about location. Maybe I'll still consider that dream beach house, but I'll check flood maps and building codes first. Or I might look for areas with good infrastructure and community resilience rather than just ignoring climate factors, or completely limiting myself to, say, the highest ground available. Finally, there's perspective. Sometimes perspective comes from looking up, standing on a Canary Islands hilltop, watching the Milky Way through a telescope, or witnessing Iceland's ancient glaciers. Those moments remind us that we're part of something vastly larger than our brief existence. In those moments, the anxieties shrink. Human history, with all of its drama, becomes a blip. It's humbling and honestly comforting, at least to me. And sure, we'll say, but this time it's different. And it is in some ways. The scale and speed of technological change are unprecedented. But that feeling, that this time is different, it's echoed throughout history. And societies have weathered upheavals before. We've adapted, we've endured. To remind myself of this, I actually go back to the Queen's speech during COVID. Here was someone who'd lived through so much, and she offered this calm, reassuring message, drawing on those historical patterns to be able to match and therefore able to tell us that we would get through this. So in that spirit, and maybe with a little bit of mischief, I'm going to leave you with a clip of what she said. See if her message resonates with whatever's making you anxious about the future. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Does any of this resonate with you? Are there other things at play that I've actually missed? And do you have any advice for others who may be watching on how to maybe feel a bit less anxious? But for now, enough from this random guy on YouTube, and instead, here's Her Majesty the Queen.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.